الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. We'll be continuing discussing the book Bulugh al-Maram by Hafiz Ibn Ajr al-Asqalani rahimahullah ta'ala, and still discussing this chapter that he mentioned as bab, as he stated, abwab al-salam wa bab wal-qard wal-rahn. So we have discussed several of those hadith in this chapter, and today inshallah ta'ala in this session we'll discuss another two of those hadith. The hadith I will be covering today inshallah ta'ala will be the hadith of Abu Hurairah and also the hadith of Aisha. So we'll have the hadith read, both hadith read, and we'll have a discussion relating to those hadith.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. The chapter of payments in advance, a loan and a pledge. Hadith narrated Abu Hurairah, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Whoever accepts other people's wealth intending to pay it back, Allah will pay it back for him. And whoever anyone accepts it intending to waste it, Allah the Most High will waste him." Reported by al-Bukhari. And hadith narrated Aisha radiallahu anha, I said, "O Messenger of Allah, so-and-so has brought clothes from Syria. What if you sent someone to him and you get from him 2 garments on credit, till it is easy for you to repay?" So he sent someone to him, but he refused. Al-Hakim and al-Bayhaqi reported it, and its narrators are reliable.
So those are the two hadith that the author have mentioned in this chapter, where he mentioned the first hadith. So we discussed both hadith by way of a takhrij of the hadith, and also looking at of the wording of the hadith. Then we discussed third matters relating to the ahkam that can be taken from the hadith. As for the first hadith that he mentioned here, and Abi Hurairah rata anhu, النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام قال: من أخذ أموال الناس يريد أداءها أداه الله عنه ومن أخذ يريد إتلافها أفلح الله. Then رواه Bukhari. So that's for the first hadith that is mentioned here, that it states regarding that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in this hadith, that as stated there or as translated, that من أخذ أموال الناس, that the person who takes the wealth of the people. And what we then he mentioned the hadith. Regarding there's something to mention regarding the wording of the hadith, that in this you find that most of the print of the hadith, that as for example that of Sheikh Bassam, that most of the print of hadith of that the print of this hadith, as for the wording of the dimension, that is stated under the Prophet Islam called man akhada amwal an-nas, that the one who takes the people's wealth, yurid adaha, that he wished to addahu Allahu anhu, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would, that the person wished to make payment of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would pay on his behalf. Then I mention وَمَنْ أَخَذَهَا وَمَنْ أَخَذَهَا. So most of the prints mention وَمَنْ أَخَذَهَا يُرِيد, that the one who takes it, أَخَذَهَا بِتْأَلْهَا there, that they mention that as for going back to Sahih Bukhari, the hadith they mention Rawahu Bukhari. As for the narration Sahih Bukhari, there's no ha upon akhada. Man akhada. So it mentioned man akhada without saying ha. Man akhadaha, but most of the narration that is mentioned in Bulugh al-Maram, that will mention man akhadaha. But as for in Sahih Bukhari, that mention man akhada without al-ha. So that's something that some have pointed out to in their takhrij or their editing of this book. So they mentioned that Sheikh Al-Fahl, that also he kind of somewhat I like this, and also that others who have done some work on Al-Bulugh al-Maram, which is Sheikh the one of Sheikh Saad, Sheikh Abdullah Saad, with his somewhat ta'liqat, that was the ta'qiq done by Abdullah ibn Omar ibn Tahir. So that of Tahir also he mentioned this point also. So you find a few that I've highlighted, that in what is mentioned in Sahih Bukhari and what is mentioned here in Bulugh al-Maram, that is a slight difference regarding al-ha that is mentioned here, but in Sahih Bukhari, the original text, it is not there. So that's something just to be mindful of. And that shows regarding of those who make tahqiq of the book, that of those who somewhat, they'll go back to the hadith, actually go back to each hadith, to the original source, and see the wording of those hadith as to what, and compare as to what is mentioned here. So that's concerning a point to mention regarding a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that in editing and checking and that one need to verify by going back to the original source itself to see what is mentioned there and what is mentioned by the books that came long after. So as for that hadith, they mention Rawahu Bukhari by way of takhrij. Rawahu Bukhari, stated in the hadith in Sahih Bukhari, that Sheikh Fahl in his checking of Sahih Bukhari, that as for this hadith he mentioned that the hadith he mentions akhrajahu Ahmad yani in his Musnad, second Bukhari in his Jami' Sahih, Ibn Majah, and he mentioned that akhrajahu shatrahu akhir, that Ibn Majah mentioned the last portion of the hadith, and he mentioned wal Bayhaqi wal Bagawi. So the hadith is in these sources. So these are the collectors of the hadith. He mentioned here with Bukhari, Ahmad, Ibn Majah, that mentioned a portion of this hadith, Bayhaqi, and al-Bagawi. Al-Bagawi in his book Sharh al-Sunnah. So al-Bagawi in his book Sharh al-Sunnah, and he mentioned hadith with is isnad. So those are the sources that have been mentioned by Sheikh Fahl regarding this particular hadith with the first hadith. As for others, that's concerning this particular hadith. That's this particular hadith that have been mentioned here. Then as for the second hadith, that is mentioned in the hadith of Aisha radhiyallahu anha, where it said قالت قلت يا رسول الله, that she said to the Prophet ﷺ, of the discussion of the Prophet ﷺ, إن فلان قدم له بزر من الشام. Baz يعني الباز يعني ثياب من الشام. Then it mentioned that a person came from Sham with these type of clothing. Then it mentioned ولو بعثت إليهم, that if you were to send out to him, فأخذت منه ثوبين بنسية إلى ميسرة فأرسل إليه فامتنى. So it mentioned that it was put to this person regarding that getting some, the Prophet ﷺ buying some clothing from him by way of he'll get the clothing now, and the payment will be made later. Then it mentioned فامتنى, that a person he refused this type of transaction. أخرجه حاكم والبيهقي ورجاله ثقات. So Ibn Hajar, he mentioned regarding takhrij of the hadith in brief, that he stated أخرجه حاكم والبيهقي ورجاله ثقات. So he mentioned the hadith is found in Al-Hakim and also Bayhaqi, and then he mentioned the next point regarding رجاله ثقات. So as for, we'll discuss concerning that as for the sources that I mentioned this hadith. So he mentioned here Al-Hakim and also second Al-Bayhaqi. Sheikh, they mentioned regarding concerning this particular second hadith, that as for this the source of this hadith, they mentioned the hadith that Sheikh Al-Fahl, that he mentioned akhrajahu Ahmad. So this hadith that have been mentioned here, it is found Ahmad is Musnad, Tirmidhi, Nasahi, Hakim wal Bayhaqi. So this hadith is found in those sources, Ahmad in his Musnad, Tirmidhi, Nasa'i, Hakim, and he mentioned al-Bayhaqi. Then he mentioned the hadith al-Sahih, that he mentioned the hadith al-Sahih. Then he mentioned something, then he mentioned al-Tanbih. كما هو ظاهر حديث in Ahmad والترمذي والنسائي وأولى بالعزو من الحاكم والبيهقي. So he mentioned a point regarding that, as something to take into account, or something that's to be mindful of, that what is apparent the hadith in the hadith, that as for the source of the hadith, that Ibn Hajar, he mentioned Hakim wal Bayhaqi. But he mentioned that as for this hadith also, it is found as mentioned in Ahmad in his Musnad, Tirmidhi, and Nasahi. And those sources are usually mentioned before the ones that he mentioned. So those sources, that hadith in some of the books of Kutub al-Sitta, of those are books of As-Sunan, At-Tirmidhi, also An-Nasa'i, also Ahmad, but he kind of somewhat went to other sources. When these sources are more renowned sources, that they mentioned that it would have been better if Ibn Hajar had mentioned these sources alongside what he had mentioned, as these sources are the more renowned, established sources that in Kutub as-Sitt or As-Sunan Arba, which is Tirmidhi والنسائي. So of those who have somewhat have lighted that, Ibn Hajar should have mentioned these sources also, and as he have mentioned these other sources of something that to take into account. So that's of the matter to take into account. That Sheikh Tahir, that Sheikh here, or Zahir, Sheikh al-Zahir, that Sheikh who is Abdullah ibn Umar ibn al-Tahir, that he mentioned. So al-Tahir, he mentioned that when he mentioned this hadith in his checking, that he stated regarding this particular hadith, that of Aisha, that you have a discussion regarding that the hadith is Sahih, Rawahu at-Tirmidhi, Nasa'i, Ahmed, Hakim, wal-Bayhaqi. So also he mentioned that of those sources that mentions hadith, the hadith in the at-Tirmidhi, Nasa'i, Ahmed, Hakim, wal-Bayhaqi. Then he mentioned that with the isnad regarding the hadith, kind of somewhat it goes back to a narrator who's Omar ibn Abi Hafsa, Omar ibn Abi Hafsa, that I mentioned the hadith, قال أنبأنا عن إكرمة عن عائشة والحديث. And also of some of the source of the hadith that by way of the hadith is narrated by way of Shu'bah and Ammara and Umara bihi and Aisha. They mentioned regarding concerning this particular hadith that there's some discussion between some of the ulama. This hadith of Aisha, there's some discussion between some of the ulama. So they have stated regarding that Ali ibn Madini, that have called Ali al-Madini and Ikrama regarding concerning that he mentioned regarding Aisha, and he mentioned that لا أعلمه يعني إكرمة سمع من أحد من أزواج النبي عليه السلام شيئا, that he mentioned that Ali ibn Madini, that he does not know of Ikrimah having heard anything from any of the wives of the Prophet alayhi salam. So that's a position taken by, or what is mentioned by Ali ibn Madini, that Ikrimah, who narrated upon Aisha, is stating that he doesn't know that him, Ikrimah, have heard anything from any of the wives of the Prophet alayhi salam, and that will include Aisha. So so that's concerning of those things that is mentioned. Also Abu Hatim, he have stated regarding that, Lam Yasma an Aisha, yani Ikrimah did not hear from Aisha. Ikrimah did not hear from Aisha. Then it mentioned regarding لكن رواه له عنه بخاري في صحيح عدة الأحاديث. So Imam Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala have narrated upon Ikrimah, and he mentioned regarding وأثبت في تاريخ سمعه عنها, that Imam Bukhari have somewhat affirmed, he mentioned في التاريخ, in the book, same as it concerning his book at-Tariq, that Ikrimah, that he heard from Aisha. So he's affirming that Ikrimah, that he heard from Aisha. So that's of those matters that are discussed regarding this particular hadith. So a discussion regarding the narrator, Ikrimah, did he hear from Aisha, that of those who affirm that he did hear from Aisha, and those who negate this, those who does not take the position hold that he heard from Aisha or any of the wives. So that's concerned a discussion between some of the ulama. Then it mentioned that at-Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentioned hadithun hasanun sahih. So of those who authentic the hadith, at-Tirmidhi, also al-Hakim. So that's concerning of those who have somewhat have taken a position regarding authenticating this particular hadith. So we have, so that's concerning that discussion. So they all generally concern the hadith that that they are more inclined toward the hadith being authentic. So that's concerning those two particular hadith regarding what is said by the ulama regarding that particular hadith. So that's what is mentioned regarding the ulama pertaining to that particular hadith. And also they mentioned that al-Dhahabi, of those also, wafaq, yani that some mention wafaqahu al-Dhahabi. Even though that statement regarding wafaqahu al-Dhahabi, there's some discussion between the contemporaries of our time regarding that the statement that al-Dhahabi, that you have done some work around the book of al-Hakim, al-Mustadrak. So they mentioned that the statement that sometimes is used, that wafaqahu al-Dhahabi, that seems that Dhahabi is in agreement with al-Hakim. The statement that there's some discussion regarding that is it a legitimate statement to be made, So you have that discussion on that matter, but it seems that it's that indicating that same that Wafiq al-Dhahabi, that Dhahabi agree with regarding his authenticity of the hadith or his judgment on the hadith, which is al-Hakim. So that's concerning of the statement of ulama pertaining to this particular hadith or these two hadiths. So the next of those matter is to discuss regarding what can be taken from this particular hadith. So as for those hadith, the hadith that have been mentioned here, that the aqwal of the ulama on this particular hadith. So we just mention as to what is said regarding the meaning of the hadith and the benefit that can be taken. That going back to what that as for this hadith, that Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala in his book that he has regarding is more awsa shar of Bulugh Maram, that goes into different fawaid. That is good if a person able can go back to those fawaid, then it's very beneficial regarding some of the points that he took from this particular hadith or these hadiths. So as for those points that are raised by the ulama regarding this particular hadith, that they mentioned that when it is stated by the Prophet ﷺ, as mentioned here by Sheikh Bassam and Sheikh Abdullah Fawzan and others, Qannas, that will take from those main ones regarding this particular hadith, that I mentioned that after the statement I mentioned, Man akhada amwal al-nas yurid ada'aha, that they mentioned that of those things that can be taken, the person adaha, that it shows regarding that the person who takes anyone's wealth, man akhada amwal al-nas, anyone who takes of a person's wealth, and that will be with that person's permission. So taking of other people's wealth with their permission, as a person is not allowed to take other people's wealth without their permission. So it is understood regarding concern a person who takes of other people's wealth with their permission in a way which is legitimate, in a way which is halal, permitted. It mentioned that as for the concern to know that taking of any person's wealth through or in any form of mu'amalat, that is halal. So taking of people's wealth and wanting to, so taking wealth in any form that is said to be halal. Any form that is said to be halal. So it would be, so they mentioned that what is sort of on the person's intention is that he wished to repay that person. So take the person's wealth and he wished to return or to repay that person what he has taken. Then it mentioned that it shows regarding al-ikhlas, that it shows regarding that of this matter, that it shows the importance of the person even regarding his general mu'amalat, a general dealing with others, that he should have good intention, that what he takes or borrows from others, that his intention is to repay it. So he mentioned that, so it showed the importance of al-ikhlas. Then he mentioned regarding concern a person mentioned that adda Allah anhu, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would pay on his behalf. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would pay this on his behalf. They mentioned that payment by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on his behalf, mean concerning that, and you making taysir for a person to be able to make that payment later. So show regarding that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make it easy or would provide that person the sustenance or that means that a person is able to make to repay that debt. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant that person that wealth, make things easy, make it accessible for the person to pay that debt because that was his intention. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make his path easy for him to pay that wealth, whether they mentioned that either in this dunya or if the person was unable because he has that wealth, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would pay that person, pay on his behalf in the akhirah. It will be, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make things, the payment will also be carried out in the akhirah on his behalf. So they mentioned that it showed of this, that the person having good intention of the benefit of this. Then I mentioned that the second case regarding, the person regarding itlaf, that a person then who can somewhat take of the wealth of someone with the intention not to pay back wealth. So they mentioned regarding concern to that itlaf, concern to that it shows regarding the person that halak. So itlaf, talafa, halaka, that a person, that thing would be that the person would go to waste or would loss. So that thing will go to loss as that person, his intention was to take of wealth, but his intention not to pay. So it shows regarding the person having an evil intention of taking of people's things with the intention not to pay, but when but I mentioned that I mentioned atlaf Allah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would, the person will reap what he sows. So they mentioned as we'll discuss, of these benefit. So it shows regarding concerning the person that of this hadith, that of those who may take of three things with a good intention to repay them, to return it back to them, and others who may take of things with not a good intention, not to repay of the person wealth, and the likes. So it shows regarding the person having, so from the hadith that they mentioned here, that from this particular hadith, that it shows regarding concerning that, as they said it now, that having good intention, even in the person mu'amalat, in the person general dealing with others, in business transaction, and of that borrowing of people's wealth, borrowing of things from others, taking things that he's supposed to return back to others. So whatever the person, the agreement is, the person try their best to fulfill it. And that is their initial intention. Whatever is agreed upon by both parties, that those things to be fulfilled accordingly. Also, it shows regarding concern that they mentioned regarding that they also from the hadith, it shows regarding that this hadith is an indication regarding that a person borrowing from peoples, from concerned the hadith, it shows concern al-qard. So this hadith is used as an evidence regarding that a person borrowing and taking things from others. So that's something which is allowed. So it shows the permissibility of borrowing from others. That is something which is allowed. It's something which is allowed. The hadith they mention here regarding the proof of this point, that if the person borrow of wealth, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make things easy for him in his repayment of this, that they mention a hadith in the Ibn Majah وابن حبان والحاكم النبي عليه السلام قال ما من مسلم يدان دينا, that any Muslim who takes off a dain, takes off borrowed a debt, يعلم الله أنه يريد أداه, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala know that a person wish to repay it. So the person that's not yet the person's intention is to pay this back. إلا أدى الله عنه, except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will pay it on his behalf. في الدنيا والآخرة. In the dunya, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will pay on his behalf. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make it easy for him to pay in this dunya or in the akhirah. As for this hadith I mentioned in the Ibn Majah, where you find out the hadith regarding concerning that this particular hadith, that there's a discussion regarding the last section of the hadith. That even Sheikh Bassam have mentioned this particular hadith, that this particular hadith regarding what is mentioned, that illa adda Allah anhu, the hadith will mention fi dunya wal akhirah. From that portion, fi dunya wal akhirah, there's some discussion regarding its authenticity. So you find that the hadith is generally said to be sound, authentic, but the portion that mentioned without per se fi dunya wal akhirah, that part is a discussion between the ulama on this. So you find ulama mentioned that it is that part of the hadith said today that it is da'if, mursal, and not authentic. And amongst those, ad-Daraqutni, and of those who are authentic, the hadith they mentioned Sheikh Albani, Sheikh Al-Nahut, and others, or the hadith to be authentic. But as for the last sentence or the last phrase of the hadith, fi dunya al-akhirah, that part is da'if. That part is da'if. So they mentioned regarding concerning hadith again, regarding concerning that the hadith it proves regarding that, as we mentioned regarding taking of a person's wealth and borrowing of people's wealth, that is something which is allowed, and that a form of the person trying to make things easier for others, and also that the person, that is a form of so that's concerned making things easier for the person, and also and to benefit others. So also of a reason regarding a person borrowing from others, and the person is able, that is allowed for him to do so. But also they mention a person that not to take off people's wealth except there's a need. And sometimes a person may do so to make things difficult upon others, or you want to take people's wealth and not to return it. So yeah, people might have different intention. So a person might borrow from someone so as to cut off another person, or he borrows from a person with the intention not to pay back, or he borrows from a person and there's no need for this. So the person also, even though there's a permissibility, not to get into a habit of borrowing without a legitimate reason. And note also that you are borrowing but you can't pay it back. You're borrowing, but know that you're unable to pay back. So they mention a person that's doing of those things, but without a person going over the top and excessive regarding of always borrowing and taking things out. And in today's society, that because of this system of you can pay later, make down payments later, and you find a lot of people that they buy off things, especially in today's ones, and buying things online. They make it very easy that a lot of people sometimes buy off things and then they find themselves in a lot of debts. And even they become, they said, they have to file for bankruptcy because that they're unable to pay those debts. So the person, if taking off debt, taking things on concessions, that the person must be mindful within one's reach. And also the intention to repay those things to pay those things back at as soon as they are able. So they mentioned that the hadith kind of somewhat show off this matter. Also the hadith highlight the importance regarding the person having good intention, and that intention that it can have a severe impact on the act. That having the intention is linked to that action and can have a serious consequence. So the person who take in this hadith, he take the item to repay or borrow that thing, but the intention to pay, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make things easy for him and grant him a way out. As for the person whose intention is not, then that will be of his instruction. Thing that they mention that that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cause of that thing, that wealth to be destroyed, of no benefit, greatly to be gained from it, and that the person will be held accountable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then also they mentioned that from the hadith shows that jaza min jins al-amal, that jaza min jins al-amal, the person whose intention is good, then good will come, what goes around come around. So the person will be rewarded according to his intent and his action. So for the person to be mindful of those things, I mentioned kama yudin al-abd yudan, as the person that the way that you do things, then that thing will come back to you. That thing will come back to you. So the person intend good, he will reap good, and the person intend evil, then what will come around will be evil. So that's concerning that particular hadith. The second hadith of Aisha radhiyallahu anha that mentioned in the said concerning that, قلت يا رسول الله إن فلان قدم له بز من الشام. That بز من الشام, that this person that came from Sham, the ulama mentioned that as for this person, someone Yahudi, and that's concerning a portion of the hadith. That they mentioned that's a portion of the hadith regarding this particular what is mentioned here. That's not the full hadith that is mentioned here. So the ulama mentioned the full hadith, where they mentioned concerning this particular hadith, that is mentioned that it is mentioned the full hadith, but this is just a portion of the hadith. So they say regarding this particular hadith that so as for this particular hadith that they mention regarding that as for what can be taken, that hadith is discussed concerning the issue regarding that a person buying something and paying later. So the person buying an item, that they'll receive the item today now, but the payment will be made later, and that's agreed with, and that's agreed upon between the buyer and the seller. So from this hadith, this hadith is to show that this type of transaction is allowed. This transaction is allowed. So the person borrowing, getting something, but then the person will pay for that thing later. So they mentioned regarding concerning this particular hadith that it is mentioned, Ahmed in his mention regarding that the hadith mentioned that from the hadith of Aisha, anna fulan ja'ahu bazzun, that a person that came, they mentioned that baz, and that person mentioned something that they mentioned that this person was a Yahud, that this person was a Yahudi that was involved in trade, that you will get things from Sham. As Sham was like a center for business transaction, so a person will go there, get items, and then bring back to the Hijaz, al-Medina. So he mentioned this Yahudi that went to Sham. So he came from Sham, mentioned that qadama min Sham. So they mentioned that wabhath, that he came from Sham, and they mentioned baz is a form of something like garment. So a form of garment that clothing that he was trading. So it mentioned that it mentioned nasi'atan, that mentioned nasi'a considered yu'akhir at-taslim at-thaman, where the person will make the payment for the item later. So the person will pay for the item later. So as for the hadith, it shows, it mentioned ila maysara. So it mentioned that لو بعثت إليه فأخذت منه ثوبين. So it mentioned that, if you were to take from him, buy from him, ثوبين. So this ثوبين that is mentioned in the hadith, نسيئة إلى ميسرة. This ثوبين that Ibn Usaymin rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentioned that ثوبين means two piece of garment. So by two ثوب or ثوبين, or it means ثوبين rida wal izar. Rida, the cover, and the bottom piece. So the top piece and the bottom piece, both are said to be one garment, but it comes with a one suit, the top and the bottom. The top part and the bottom. Or you mentioned that thawbain, actually two pieces, two separate garment. So that's what is discussed between the ulama. So in any case, that also, it showed that the Prophet Islam buying multiple garment, but he wanted to receive to pay for them later. So I mentioned ila maysara. So the ulama discussed regarding that, that he will pay for that guy. He will pay for that later. That a discussion regarding that al-maysar, that when he's able. So they mentioned that this type of maysara is somewhat the ajal as to the payment when it to be made is somewhat, it is majhul. It is somewhat unknown. But also we mentioned that which is for a person to buy something and payment of an unknown time, it is not allowed. But I mentioned that ila maysar, which is when I'm able. So they mentioned that what is meant by ila maysar, it is that they mentioned that what is meant by this, at a time that I'm able to that I have the money is with me, that I can pay for it. So at that point I'll pay. So as soon as I receive the money, I'll give it to you. And I have access to that money, I'll give it to you. So that, as I mentioned, so it shows that that al-maysara, meaning as soon as I'm able and I have that money come into my possession, I'll pay for the item. So it's not something which is that it is left open. It is left open. But the time period is as soon as I'm able to pay. As soon as I receive the money, I'll pay for it. So they mentioned if that's the case then, and it's agreed upon by both parties, the buyer and the seller, then it's a valid transaction. So from this, they mentioned that overall, concerning from the hadith, that as we mentioned, that they mentioned a person who came, that that he was somewhat in some narrations, and he was very, he refused, that he didn't accept that suggestion that was given by the Prophet ﷺ regarding the guy, that's what they mentioned, famtana, that he refused. So they mentioned that it shows also from the hadith, where they mentioned famtana, that a transaction, the person who's the seller, he is a person which is free, he have the right to either to accept the transaction or to refuse. So a person who's the seller is not forced that he has to accept everyone who comes to buy the item. So he still have that freedom for him to refuse certain people, or certain. So he's he have the freedom to refuse certain people based upon what they. So he's allowed to refuse certain people in certain transactions. So that's concerned. So that shows. So they mentioned that's the point of the hadith. Also, so they mentioned also from the hadith that they make sure that it shows that mention the person Yahud, that a Muslim can conduct business transaction or transactions, buy and sell with Muslim and non-Muslim alike. So this person mentioned that he was Yahud. So the Prophet Islam did do transaction or wanted to do transaction with a person who was a Yahud. So any person who is not of the faith of Islam is allowed for one to do transaction with them. So they mentioned that, of those who mentioned that they find the Yahud, it was known that their transaction at times would involve things of riba. So if it's not directly known that the thing that is selling is directly attached to riba, you can buy whatever you want from him. But if you know that that item that he's selling, this item that he's selling, is a riba item, then leave it. But the person don't know, even the person know that he's involved, like in today's, that a lot of business that they involve sometimes with, may be involved in things of riba, but you can still buy from them. You can still buy from them even though they may be involved in riba. So still you're allowed to do transaction with them. Unless you know that a business is only about riba. Unless that business is only about a riba. They mentioned regarding concern also with this transaction that the Prophet said that you wish to pay for later, this payment can be done outside thing which is ribawiyah. So also another point that all about mentioned regarding this hadith, that these type of transaction, you're getting the item from the seller and you're paying later, that this transaction should not be within the class or the group of item that are said to be ribawiyah, item of interest. Whereas those items, they have to be sold, the same items, same value or the same, with a different system as we have outlined in the Bab of Riba, where they are end-to-end and also that they are equal in their measurement and weight. So that's concerning Bab of Riba. So the item should be free from riba regarding this type of transaction where you are buying something, getting it now, and you pay later. So those are the points that they mentioned regarding this matter. So they mentioned that again regarding the point, regarding that that they mentioned that as Sheikh Bassam and others mentioned, as he mentioned the 9 points, فيه دليل على جواز معاملات من في ماله شبه haram. That it shows the permissibility that buying from someone, doing a transaction with someone that is wealth that may have some shubha, there's some little doubtful points regarding it, some suspicion about his wealth. Regarding maybe it may involve things of riba, but from the hadith they mentioned that it is allowed. So they mentioned that فإن المعروف عن اليهود تعامل مع الربا, that the Yahud, they were known to be people involved in riba transaction. So they mentioned وأخذ الرشوة, and taking of things on and other acts. That they mentioned on the and acts, they mentioned وهذا ما لم يكن متصرف فيه وعين المال حرام. As long as you know that particular act, as long as you know that particular transaction, it is not directly all about thing which is haram. That thing was bought from something which is riba only, then no. So this shows regarding that transaction can be done with any, regardless of their fate. And also it shows regarding the dimension of Prophet Islam regarding that is good conduct. So of the hadith also it showed the Prophet Islam regarding is good conduct, where this person that refused to have that transaction with him and the Prophet Islam didn't per se that take any further action against the person. The Prophet Islam did not take any action against this person who refused to have that conduct that transaction with him. So the Prophet Islam didn't per se take further action against this person. So there's a problem in his conduct that people sometimes refuse him in business transaction, and he didn't per se that verbally abuse the person, nor did he try to take any sanction against the person. He just let the matter go. He let the matter go. So the Muslim regarding his the Muslim to be mindful of this. That a person sometimes may not want to enter into a transaction with you. Let the matter go, and not to take it, as they say, personal, and then escalate the matter into other things, and bring other things involved into that matter. So they mentioned regarding concerns to know that buying things and paying later, that as Cindy that I've mentioned regarding concerning of his taliqat and musnad of Imam Ahmad, he mentioned لعلها regarding لعلها كانت متوقع إلى أجل معلوم, that the Prophet does know that he was expecting that at a certain time he will have that money. So it was that he was that highly expected that at a certain point he will have that money to pay for that item. That I mentioned وإلا فالجهالة الأجل مفسدت عند أهل العلم, that something to be that there's no time that is set, then that's not allowed. Regarding transaction. So that's of the point that is taken from this particular hadith. So these are the points that are taken from this particular hadith regarding that making things easy and buying things where you pay later. So with this, inshallah ta'ala, we'll end this discussion and end this session today. وبالله تعالى توفيق وهذه السبيل والآخرة والحمد لله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.